Hello, my name's Rich from Medieval History Buff. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching my video, and if you like my content, please feel free to subscribe, like, comment and share. Although I do mention this again slightly later on in the video, I will just make clear that this video is the second on my series on Edward II. I'll provide a link for part 1, which was concentrated on the years 1307 to 1312 and Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston. This video is going to be mainly concentrated on the years 1312 and 1313. And there will obviously be further parts to come, although I'm not quite sure how many yet, because I don't want to make my videos too long. This is my second video on Edward II. The first video, which I'll provide a link to in the description below, was on Edward's relationship with Piers Gaveston. This video is going to look at the reign after the murder of Piers and how Edward's kingship carried on after the death of his favourite. The murder of Piers in 1312 was quite an extraordinary moment and was a damning indictment on Edward II. It was not a little humiliating for the king as well. The man he had cherished like a brother had been brought down by his nobles. This undermined Edward's authority as king, absolutely. And to make matters worse for Edward, it wasn't just the nobility who rejoiced at the end of Piers. The general population also despised the king's favourite and delighted in his death. Such was the loathing for the man who had elevated himself so unjustly to king-like status. All that remained for Edward after the death of Piers was to try and salvage his kingship. After recent events, he was now at very real danger of being deposed. But it wasn't only Edward with worries after the death of Piers. The nobility, with the Earls of Lancaster and Warwick being the most prominent among them, were fully aware of the magnitude of their actions and knew that they were not only running the risk of a bloody civil war, but also their own personal safety was now in very real danger. They had not only deprived the king of his companion, but had also backed him into a corner. There was a very real possibility that Edward would seek the removal of these men who had brought about Piers's downfall, for not only the sake of his own personal authority as king, but also in the name of self-gratification and revenge. So the earls made an agreement amongst themselves that if the time came when one or more of them were being threatened by Edward, then they would all unite and take up arms. When he had heard the news of Piers's death, Edward had given a slightly peculiar reaction, and even appeared to accuse Piers of acting foolishly. But there was no doubt that the king was distraught, and there is also no doubt that he would not forgive. He sought advice from his council as to the wisest course of action. Among those now closest to the king was the Earl of Pembroke and Hugh Despenser the elder, both of whom, like Piers, were men looking to advance themselves. They, among others, urged the king to go on the attack. But wiser heads among the council knew that Edward could not afford a civil war, particularly at this time. In Scotland, Robert Bruce was now establishing himself in power and was also threatening the north of England. Edward could not become distracted from his kingly responsibilities. But Edward was becoming consumed by the idea of vengeance, and he now called for a parliament which was to be held in London. The earls did indeed come to London, but not without a large retinue of men-at-arms. The Earl of Lancaster, for example, is said to have been accompanied by around 2,500 men. With the other earls and barons having similarly large numbers, the situation was now volatile and very dangerous for both sides. Unsurprisingly, the nobles didn't actually attend the parliament and instead sent representatives to the king. But Edward still seems to have been intent on taking the fight to the nobles, but he was urged to show restraint. One reason for this was the fact that the nobles' forces were significantly bigger than the king's, and if he did engage them in battle, it could prove to be disastrous for Edward. But another factor in Edward's decision-making was the fact that he was playing host to his brother-in-law, Louis. Louis, who would be King Louis X of France, was the brother of Edward's young bride, Isabella. Edward could hardly afford to wage war on his own subjects when Isabella's and Louis's father, Philip IV, was already unimpressed by Edward's kingship and how he treated Isabella, and seemed to overlook her. If Edward engaged in civil war whilst Louis was at his court, this could prove to be the final tipping point for Philip, who could then potentially intervene in English affairs, and this would cause further chaos if it came to pass. But after so much turmoil, Edward finally had some cause to celebrate. On the 13th of November 1312, Isabella gave birth to a baby boy at Windsor. He was named after his father and would go on to become King Edward III and one of the mightiest warrior kings in all medieval history. With negotiations for a peace with the barons at a near standstill, Edward decided to leave London and visit his queen and his newborn heir. Whilst this seems, on the surface at least, to have been a reasonable and understandable act, it was also undoubtedly a calculated move on Edward's part to further antagonise the nobles. By leaving his earls and barons in London, he was effectively leaving them in limbo. With so many men to provide provisions for and pay, the longer they failed to make headway into negotiations with the king, the more expensive things would become for the earls and barons. And Edward was fully aware of this, and he made no effort to return to London quickly at least, and is even accused of feigning illness. By this point, it has to be said that Edward is taking liberties. Edward then had another perfect excuse to further antagonise his nobles when Philip IV invited Edward to his court in France, an invitation that was readily accepted by Edward. But the English king was allowing his dispute with the nobles to preoccupy his mind, and matters elsewhere in England were going to pot. Robert Bruce's incursions into the north were gradually penetrating further and further south, and he even made it as far south as York. But this still did not deter Edward, and he and Isabella set out for France. The author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, The Life of Edward II, rather bluntly sums up the first 6 years of Edward II's reign. He had accomplished absolutely nothing except for making an advantageous marriage which had quickly produced a son and heir. This proved to be the highlight of the early part of Edward's reign. He was needlessly making enemies, and he was at risk on 2 counts of being deposed. The first and most obvious threat came from his nobility, the second coming from Robert Bruce. There was a growing fear in England that the Scots would even make it as far south as London. But this does not seem to have unduly concerned Edward, hence why he departed from the kingdom and left for France. He was complacent, and I think you could call him lazy. But Edward would not be able to run away from his problems forever, and they would eventually catch up with him. There'll be more on this in part 3, including information on the Battle of Bannockburn, which would prove to be a total disaster for Edward.